Chapter 2, Part 1. Death in Blackstone.
Me scribe has made a comment that I can only describe as insulting. She reminds me that you don't know who I am. She asks whether it's a deliberate ploy to add mystery. I laughed at that, and then realized she was serious. I've never needed to introduce myself before. My reputation has always preceded me, and the audiences have gathered at the merest hearsay of me coming. Yet, she points out that renown only travels in memory and tradition, not on parchment. It makes me balk at this work I undertake. Such an important tale, and yet how can you hear the emotion in me voice, or see a tear form in me eye? You cannot answer the question to pose, nor join in the laughter of a crowd made merry by ale. Will you draw close to your kin as I cast a spell o' winter, or, when the epic stirs to battle, will you bang your flagons to raise its clamour? This written form is a truly inhuman way to keep such memories alive. So be it. Just know that I am Durian Weaver, speaking with the wisdom of years. Soon you'll meet a different Durian Weaver, a man so far in me memory that I own him as just another actor in me cast. A man of conviction, perhaps arrogance, who thought his wonderful tales were a feast of light and colour in the drab lives of simple folk. His greatest contribution was to survive to stand before you today. A child of our lands, a wanderer from community to clan. I had avoided Blackstone for the first 24 years of my life. When I finally made the journey, it was the late spring of 1188 by the Durian calendar, or so my scribe tells me. 7 years after Kerne had fled the monastery. I arrived and went to the Old Fire Inn, as it seemed to be a place large enough for people to gather. There I made it known that I would tell tales that evening, and stirred a great excitement in that soulless place. I can still picture that evening, even though many of my more recent memories have lost colour and clarity. I must admit that a rare event transpired. I lost me rhythm. Durian Weaver, The Keatish Cycle.
Leusios stared out the open shutters at the setting sun, struggling with the memory of fire coursing up the walls and beams. The smell of smoke and cooking meat coming from the inn's kitchen added a chilling edge to the unwelcome memory. The mill, his workplace, his home, his inheritance, all just a scorched ruin on the riverbank now. He unconsciously stroked the scar on his cheek and shuddered. He could still hear Gaeva's screeching voice, even as she had been dead now for 3 years. Fingers of fading light found their way in between the old masonry and roof joints. The inn was the oldest building in Blackstone. Some said it was as old as the monastery, hearsay that he dismissed. The styles were completely different. He stared out onto the market round, mired in guilt and poverty. Was he just another broken life in a weary village on the brink of starvation? No. He was special. He had to be. His scar itched again. There was a knock. "Come in," he said. Anya put her head around the simple plank door. "Are you coming down to hear the bard?" "Ah, that was why Gwendol was roasting mutton. I don't like singing." "This one doesn't sing," she pointed out. "He's a tale-teller." "Small mercies." He sighed and gave his childhood friend a thin smile. "Dear Anya, you never give up on me. All those years you let me help out at the mill have to count for something." She grinned. "It's I who owe you. I needed your help because Kerne—" He didn't finish the sentence. His father had been a useless drunk. How could he have been that man's son? He reached out, intending to close the shutters. Long shadows stretched across the market round. It had been busy earlier, as Mistress Murgathwin had gathered the villagers to grind corn by hand. But it was empty now. The loss of the mill was strangling the village's meager food supplies. His guilt sharpened. "What is it?" He heard Anya walk up behind him, the old boards creaking under her light tread. She helped Gwendol with the inn on special nights like this when the whole village would squeeze into his ample-sized common room. She had convinced him to let Leusios have this room in return for work. It wasn't as if the traders were flooding through. Such generosity cost the innkeeper nothing. He watched Vibna Aquitus, the new priest, leave her small church and head towards the old fire inn. He sighed and pressed his forehead against the wooden frame. "I can't spend me life being the village handyman or shearing Uthkar's sheep. There has to be more for me." "You're good with your hands. People appreciate your help. Carpentry is a worthy skill, but if you want to do more, then you could apprentice with Hanley Smith." The thought of working with fire chilled him. "I suppose so," was all he could mutter. His senses prickled. One of the farmhands from down the valley was crossing the market round towards the inn. Nothing appeared out of the ordinary for several heartbeats. He shook his head and started to close the shutters when a huge figure jogged into the market round. "Kerne?" he gasped. "Really?" Anya leaned forwards to see past him. The half-orc ran to the center of the round and looked about him, as if sensing prey. He was suited in his hide armor and wore his steel helmet. The hilt of his great sword stood proud over his right shoulder. "And he's ready for a fight." They both watched, fascinated as the half-orc snapped onto the trail of his quarry. Rather than run, he slowed to a more measured pace, lifting the sword's harness over his head so he could draw the blade. He headed directly for the inn. "I think I want to go downstairs, after all," mused Leusios. Jorwin Weaver lost his rhythm and stared at the newcomer. He had followed a farm worker in and captured the bard's attention immediately. It was neither his size, which was immense, nor his fighting gear, which was well used. Something about the warrior tantalized his bardic instincts. His gear was a mix of orcish hide armor and pieces of Keetish hardened leather. His head was covered by a helmet with a crude visor of iron slats. The break in the tail alerted everyone to his arrival, and Jorwin sensed the atmosphere of the crowd become poisoned by suspicion. "Forgive the intrusion," said the warrior. 3 words. Just 3 words, and Jorwin fell in love with that voice. This young man spoke with deep, silvered syllables that any bard would have envied. Then there were his eyes. They shone bright blue from the darkness of his helm, like windows out to a summer sky.
"Why are you here?"
demanded one of the hunters.
"You're not welcome,"
snarled an older man. Jorwin knew him as Kendlewick Tanner. He was a thin, angular man with a shock of sparse, curly black hair and a face made for grimacing, not smiling. A farmer next to the tanner nodded sourly. Despite the antipathy to the newcomer, Jorwin could not let him leave.
"Join us. There's space."
He raised his hand to indicate an empty spot by Gwendol's serving table. Entreating the warrior to stay soured attitudes further, but, as a bard, he was above such petty squabbles. The warrior did not answer. Instead, his hands went to his helmet, and he pulled it free. Jorwin's mouth dropped open agape. Bards were never meant to show surprise in front of their audiences, let alone be stunned. The face was not fair as the voice predicted, nor was it plain. There was a bulge in his lips from teeth more suited to tearing meat than chewing bread. They were set in a powerful jaw that framed a dangerous face, yet his presence exuded a compelling aura of bestial beauty. His long hair was Keetish black, but his skin was not pale like a Keats. It was a dusky brown, as if tanned by the sun and weathered by the wind. His face bones were heavy, and his ears were broad with slight points. A half-orc? Such aberrations were killed at birth by humans and orcs alike. Always the social oil of Blackstone, Gwyndol cleared his throat. "A new cask of ale," he announced, and bustled through the crowd to make a show of opening the trap door to the cellar. "Let me fetch it up. I missed the last cask," offered the laborer who had arrived just ahead of the half-orc. "Farmer Toothley had us working hard all day. I'm parched." "Good man, Kerne," Gwyndol said, his heartiness a little overinflated. "Bring up the one on the left." He clapped him on the shoulder as the laborer headed down into the cellar. "Why ye here, Drethek?" demanded a young hunter. The bard knew more insults in Old Keetish than any person alive, and Drethek was one of the worst. Half-breed, he had called the warrior. "Not to pick a fight with you, Meekrig," came the measured response. Fascinated, Jorwin watched every expression. The sky-blue eyes were searching for something. "What are ye seeking?" he asked. Kerne's broad nostrils flared, drawing in the hoppy tang of beer and sweat. "Something evil," he said, scanning the room. "It is here, amongst you." "If there's evil here, then it came with you," hissed Kendlewick. The half-orc tensed. Kendlewick started back in fear. But the tanner was not his focus. He charged for the cellar steps. "Kerne!" The beautiful voice rose into a bellow of alarm. "Get up from there!" There was a snarl from the cellar, and then a blood-curdling scream. Leusios spilled his ale as the shriek of agony tore through the crowd around him. He leapt to his feet, and, as everyone else shrank back, he ran forwards. The priest Vibna was quicker. She followed Kerne into the cellar, but Kernen's scream had already cut off. Leusios reached the steps and looked down as the massive figure of Kerne started to climb back up, head bowed. Strange, Leusios thought. He could smell an unusual spicy tang in the air. The moment it pricked his nose, it sent goosebumps coursing over his scalp and down his spine. It had a vague familiarity, as if he had smelled it only once before in his life. "He's dead," the half-orc announced with regret as he reached the top of the steps. "And it's gone." Vibna stepped from the half-orc's shadow. The willowy priest was a Durian from the south. Durian's skin was a shade darker than Keetish, and should have added an impression of health, but not for a priest. Despite only being in her early 30s, Vibna always looked haggard and gaunt, perhaps from an illness in her youth. Even her hair was a pallid brown, lying thin on her scalp. She coughed as if the simple act of climbing the steps from the cellar was too demanding. She spoke in precise Durian accent. "Yes, Kerne is dead, and by no natural means." That sent a ripple through the crowd. "Enough riddles," snapped Kendlewick anxiously. "What happened? We want answers." Vibna steepled her thin fingers, a gesture close to prayer that underlined her sincerity. "I mean that a man goes into a cellar alone. He is killed, and yet he is still alone. Not only is he killed, the blood is drained out of him within several heartbeats." There was a collective gasp, and mutters darted through the crowd. Fascinated, Leusios leaned closer to look into the cellar. Kernen's twisted body had not just been drained of blood, but of every drop of fluid. Desiccated flesh held his jaw open in an eternal scream, and his hands were now emaciated claws, still fending off his attacker. There was a single wound. His throat had been torn out. The spicy aroma was stronger, emanating from the cellar. It tingled against his skin and made him shudder. The memory of mill full of flames and smoke flashed past his mind's eye. "It's that scorched half-breed!" shouted someone from behind him. There was muttered agreement led by Kendlewick and his coven of doomslayers. Kerne gave no reaction to such a stupid slur. Leusios was unimpressed. A warrior of his size should have demanded any accuser to draw his blade or be silent. Leusios glowered as Kendlewick lowered his head to whisper venom to his companions. He, too, had known Kendlewick's contempt all of his life. Unfortunately, The best place to build the mill on the river had been downwind of the village, next to the tannery. Kendlewick and Geva, his stepmother, would sharpen each other's tongues with the latest gossip. Naturally, the tanner had joined in with Geva's insults at her white-haired freak of a stepson.
"We said we didn't want his kind here, and now Fernan is dead," growled Kendlewick. "Nonsense!"
Mistress Murgathwin admonished Kendlewick and the folk around him with a whip-like wag of her finger. She may have been thin and grey, but the force of her personality parted the crowd around her. No one dared to be in the line of Murgathwin's ire.
"You should all be ashamed of yourself for such a lack of common sense. Kerne was in plain sight the whole time. Pay more attention to what's going on around you, and less to the bottom of your ale beaker."
Kendlewick went red and was about to retort, but a big man with a full beard appeared at her shoulder. Captain Howe. Once a mercenary, he had commanded the village militia ever since the Orc Raid of 1184. The concept of military rank and discipline eluded most Keats, but Hal had a gruff magnetism and years of combat experience.
"But you did follow Fernan into the inn, Kerne,"
the captain pointed out, without any tone of accusation.
"We had heard you'd come back to the mountains last year. It's been common talk in the village. And now you come here. Why?"
Finally, Kerne spoke. "I did not follow him directly. I was tracking something malicious, something evil from the mountains. I never saw it." He shrugged his broad shoulders. "I just felt it." He pointed to the east. It seized on Fernan's trail as it crossed the path to the valley farms. I sensed it change direction and pursue him. That led me here.
"So why didn't you warn him?"
Meekrig Hunter accused him. "I thought him safe." The half-orc barely raised his voice, but an edge of irritation made everyone tense. I had no idea what it was or its intent. I certainly did not think it would be able to enter the cellar unseen. The half-orc put his palm to his chest. "Yes, today I have failed. I swear on my honor that be it beast or demon, I will find it and kill it." With that simple statement, Kerne placed his helmet back on his head.
"Honor?"
scoffed Kendlewick, and turned to mutter to his cronies. Leusios felt a surge of excitement. This thing had entered the cellar unseen. Was it tied to magic? Magic. A superstition to anyone else. To Leusios, it was a fascination that gnawed at his very soul. People told stories of demons as spirits that were as malevolent as they were mystical. He had to know more.
"I'll help."
Kerne's eyes met Leusios's for the first time in many years. Did the half-orc remember the miller's boy? They had barely exchanged a single word before. Now they appraised each other. In many ways they were opposites. The half-orc was intimidating, his physical power exuding from his bulk and poise, and his mane of hair was silky thick and as black as night. In contrast, Leusios's ice-white hair was so fine that it easily caught the lightest breeze. His slender frame had a wiry strength, the benefit of working the mill from childhood to cover his father's incompetence. "You saw what happened to Fernan. There is danger," Kerne warned him. Leusios grinned with barely concealed excitement. Anything was better than wasting his time doing odd jobs. "If Blackstone's in danger, then I'll take the risk." His bravado was a deliberate attempt to impress the simple folk around him, who nodded in appreciation. "Then you are welcome." The half-orc inclined his head as if thinking. "Luca, isn't it?"
"I prefer Leusios."
He reached out his hand. "My thanks, Leusios." Kerne shook it and gave him an approving nod.
"I will come too,"
said the bard. He was dressed in travel-stained leathers and looked very average. Black, Keatish hair and a short beard, normal height and pale skin. Yet his blue-green eyes danced with intelligence. He, too, offered his hand to Kerne, and Lucius noted how his eyes darted to him as well, probably taking in the white hair and thinking, what a freak. The bard hid any reaction well.
Jorwin Weaver,
he introduced himself to Kerne. The half-orc bowed deeply before taking the proffered hand. I am honored, Master Bard.
I'm far from being a master bard yet,
Jorwin admitted easily. Leusios butted in to offer his own hand to Jorwin, who took it. The bard's hands were coarse from an outside life, and his grip was strong. I will join you too, decided Vibna in a matter-of-fact manner. There was a stir of surprise through the tavern. Leusios caught his snort of derision just in time. He barely knew the priest, but the willowy woman looked too ill and weak to face danger.
There is no need, Kerne assured her.
And evil afflicts the people for whom I bear responsibility. The Corpus Vigilos is the protector of humanity. It is my duty. She held herself upright, showing steel to her otherwise benign manner. I will accompany you. Kerne acquiesced with a bow of his head.
Then you, too, have my thanks.
What of the monks? Asked Kendlewick. They promised their protection, and if this is some evil spirit, then who better than to deal with it?
There were murmurs of doubt. 4 years was not long enough for the village to forgive the monks for being too slow to aid them when orc raiders last struck. Murgathwin glanced at Kerne and then answered, speaking to the entire crowd.
Kerne's offer is generous and immediate. I will go to the monastery tomorrow morning and tell them what has happened. But this monster is loose, and we need to act. I, for one, am grateful.
She inclined her head to Kerne, who looked surprised at such kind language, and bowed in gratitude. You said you followed it here. Where is it now? Vibna asked. Kerne closed his eyes and was quiet for a short time. Then he shook his head. I cannot feel it. There was a mutter of derision from the villagers around Kendlewick. Captain Howe cleared his throat and moved into the space around Kerne.
We'll raise the militia to protect Blackstone.
He offered his hand to Kerne.
Anyone who can track this beast down will have our gratitude.
The warrior took the grip cautiously. We had better move swiftly. He moved to pull it away. The captain put a hand on his shoulder and refused to let go.
Don't be hasty. No one is going anywhere until dawn.
Let the half-breed go and get killed if he wants to,
sneered Meekrig.
Enough, Howell growled. No one leaves Blackstone until they have the quality of light to fight by.
Kerne complied with a nod. Then Hal leaned closer to the half-orc to mutter something. The warrior listened intently and gave a quiet response. Hal gave him a firm handshake of thanks and released him. Leusios wasn't sure, but he thought he'd heard the captain mention his daughter, Elayna.
As if the Drethic needs light,
scoffed Kendlewick, but was ignored. Leusios was curious to see where he had put himself by allying with Kerne. The villagers looked to them to get the killer, but association with Kerne discomforted them. Fools. Lucius knew a worker should always use the right tool. Outcast or not, the half-orc warrior was exactly who they needed. That concludes the first part of Chapter 2, Death in Blackstone. The party has formed, and next time, Kerne leads them in pursuit of the beast, meets Elayna, and Leusios makes a startling discovery. See you next week.